Hello. Today Road to GH will teaser. Willow had been feeling an overwhelming sense of exhaustion creeping in over the past few weeks, the kind that didn't respond to rest or routine checkups. It started subtly, slight fatigue during her shifts, a bit of dizziness here and there, but then came the sudden blackouts, striking like lightning in a clear sky. At first, it was just a few fleeting moments. Blinking and forgetting what room she was in, walking into GH with no recollection of how she got there, or losing track of entire conversations. But soon those empty stretches of time expanded into terrifying gaps, entire hours she couldn't account for, faces she couldn't name, and places she swore she'd never visited but whose layout she somehow remembered in vivid detail. Her body was reacting as though it were under siege, trembling uncontrollably, drenched in cold sweat, heart hammering against her ribs with a primal warning she couldn't interpret. It felt like her physical form was protesting, resisting something she hadn't consciously consented to, something that was trying to claw its way out from within. The incident with Daisy only deepened the spiral. When Sasha discovered her daughter resting in a strange bassinet that did not match the hospital-issued ID bracelet, the initial reaction was procedural, a possible glitch in the security system, maybe a rogue nurse, a one-time breach. But then the footage emerged, grainy, distorted clips from a nursery camera that captured a shadowy female figure with long hair and a frail frame, standing beside the crib for several minutes, unmoving, eerily still. She activated the baby's phone and then disappeared as silently as she had come, leaving no trace. The resemblance was haunting. Investigators assumed Willow had been off-duty, perhaps asleep in the Quartermain mansion during the time of the breach. But Willow couldn't confirm anything. All she could recall was walking up to her bedroom, closing the door, and then waking up in the dead of night with an icy cloth clenched in her hand and a pounding headache, as though she had been trying to erase something unspeakable from her memory, something she might have seen, or perhaps something she had done. The strangeness continued to escalate. Willow began to feel the presence of another entity within her. A force not external but embedded deep in her psyche, lurking just beyond the threshold of conscious awareness. It wasn't just the amnesia or the insomnia. It was the tangible sense that someone else was breathing through her lungs, guiding her hands during those lost hours, leaving behind cryptic evidence of their presence. Scratches on her wrists she couldn't explain. A crumpled note shoved into her jacket pocket that she didn't remember writing. Repeating the name, Daisy, over and over, surrounded by a hastily drawn symbol that resembled wings. Penguin wings. The same symbol from years ago, tied to the infamy of Nellie and the chaos she had unleashed through a simple, seemingly innocent mobile phone. The name echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. Nellie. Her twin. Her tormentor. Her ghost. Or maybe not a ghost at all. As Sasha fled Port Charles with Daisy in her arms, terrified by the growing threats and bizarre manipulations, Willow remained behind, frozen in a world she no longer recognized. She sat alone in her examination room, staring blankly at an old photograph of Nellie, a remnant from a time when the past was still safely buried. But now it was as though the photograph had come alive, the smirk in Nellie's eyes reaching through the lens and piercing into Willow's soul. She wasn't just remembering Nellie. She was becoming her. The resemblance was no longer skin-deep. It was psychological. Existential. A sudden and unsettling kinship began to take root, fed by grief, guilt, and maternal despair. Her hands, once warm with the touch of Wiley and Amelia, were now cold and empty. Their absence gnawed at her, hollowing out her identity with each passing day. Without them, Willow felt like an echo of herself, a void wrapped in skin. In that darkness, something else began to rise. A voice. Soft, mocking, feminine. It didn't speak in complete sentences at first, just suggestions, urges, fragments of emotion that didn't feel like her own. But they were persuasive. They offered comfort, purpose, vengeance. They told her what to do when she couldn't think, how to feel when her heart was numb. And eventually, that voice began to laugh. A laugh she didn't recognize, but somehow knew. She heard it again and again, and one day it came from her own lips while she stared at herself in the mirror. Her reflection had changed. The smile no longer felt maternal, it was sly, dangerous. Her gaze sharpened, her fingers twitching as they traced the penguin wing insignia into the condensation of her desk. A symbol of memory, of legacy, of madness. The past had returned with talons, and it was no longer confined to memory. The cruel irony was not lost on Willow. The same tactics Nellie had used to torture Carly were now manifesting in her own behavior, unbidden, uncontrollable. But this time, Carly wasn't the target. It was Michael. It was Sasha. It was every person Willow had once called family. Every person who now saw her as something fragile, broken, and expendable. And perhaps, just perhaps, her other self had grown tired of being underestimated. This fractured duality consumed her every waking thought. She began to wonder if Nellie had ever truly died, or if her soul had simply taken refuge inside the only person who had ever shared her blood. The thought was horrifying. Yet, it also thrilled her in some perverse, forbidden way. She found herself imagining Daisy as her own child, constructing memories that never existed, telling herself stories of rocking the baby to sleep or singing lullabies she had never sung. Her mind, once rooted in compassion and caregiving, had begun to fray into a dangerous tapestry of delusion and desire. Each blackout became a portal. Each returned memory was more fragmented than the last. And in every missing moment, there was the growing suspicion that Nellie, if not in body, then in essence, was reclaiming territory. The next incident confirmed everyone's worst fears. The therapist's office had been broken into. Security footage was wiped. Walls were tagged with the same winged symbol. A recording of Willow's most recent session had been deleted, leaving behind only a handwritten note, scrawled in ink that matched the earlier mysterious pages. She wasn't strong enough. I am. No fingerprints. No sign of forced entry. Only a lingering scent of jasmine, Nellie's perfume. There were whispers in the corridors of GH now. Murmurs about commitment, about psychiatric holds, about danger not just to others but to herself. But no one could bring themselves to speak those words to Willow's face. Not yet. Because when she walked down those sterile hallways, she still wore the badge. She still smiled and said good morning. And yet, beneath that surface lay something far more volatile, something no longer bound by memory, morality, or even time. Willow was no longer just losing herself. She was evolving into something new. Something terrifying. And the question that now loomed over Port Charles was no longer, what's wrong with Willow, but rather, who is she now, and what will she do next? No one could say for certain what was truly happening, not the doctors, not Michael, not even Willow herself. The uncertainty surrounding her descent into mental instability had become a source of quiet panic among those closest to her, though few dared voice it aloud. Her therapist had cautiously suggested that Willow might be suffering from a complex psychiatric condition, possibly dissociative identity disorder, brought on by prolonged psychological trauma. This wasn't just grief or exhaustion anymore, this was something deeper, darker, something that couldn't be fixed with rest or medication alone. It was as though a fracture had formed within her psyche, and into that fracture had stepped a new personality, fully formed, dangerously autonomous, and hauntingly familiar. The name they didn't want to say, but all silently feared, was Nellie. The mounting evidence was impossible to ignore. Willow's room had begun to reflect the psyche of someone unraveling, or perhaps someone dividing. Crude drawings of Daisy were taped all over the walls, done in a shaky, obsessive hand. Underneath her pillow, folded like a secret talisman, were scraps of baby clothes, some stained, others with the tags still on. Printed medical records of Daisy, complete with notes and highlighted details, were found in Willow's desk drawer, even though she insisted she hadn't accessed the hospital system in weeks. It was becoming increasingly clear that whoever had done this had an intimate, calculated interest in Daisy. But when questioned, Willow offered nothing but confusion and mounting dread. She couldn't explain the documents, couldn't recall drawing anything, and yet some part of her felt a sickening familiarity with every scribble and every scrap of fabric. While doctors debated the best course of treatment, unsure whether to pursue medication, inpatient care, or more aggressive therapy, Willow began to confront a more terrifying possibility. That she was no longer simply a patient, but the battleground for a psychological war between two selves. One was the Willow everyone knew, gentle, maternal, compassionate, and the other was something else entirely. The other self was calculating, driven, and possessed an unsettling clarity of purpose, to reclaim the identity of a mother, by any means necessary. It didn't just want to feel like a mother again, it wanted to be one, even if that meant stealing a child and rewriting history. The tipping point came when yet another security breach occurred, this time at her therapist's office. The session recordings had been meticulously erased, not deleted by accident but purged with the deliberate skill of someone who knew how to avoid detection. The walls were defaced with the unmistakable winged penguin insignia, identical to the symbol once associated with Nellie's manipulation tactics years ago. It was no longer possible to write these incidents off as mere coincidence. Something deeply intentional was unfolding, and it was centered around Willow, or rather, the person she might be becoming. Concern for Daisy's safety escalated into quiet alarm. While the child remained physically unharmed under Sasha's protective care, the fear that Willow, or the personality inside her, might eventually act on its obsession had begun to spread. Even Michael, who had tried desperately to believe in Willow's innocence, now watched her with wary detachment. He couldn't ignore her increasingly erratic behavior, the way she sometimes stared into nothingness as if conversing with someone invisible, the way she whispered to herself under her breath, sometimes repeating Daisy's name as though it were a chant or a prayer. In one particularly jarring moment, he had caught her cradling a blanket as if it were a baby, murmuring a lullaby she used to sing to Wiley, but her eyes were distant, glazed, as though it wasn't Wiley she was seeing, or even Amelia. When he called her name, she didn't respond. When she finally looked up, her smile was empty, and for a moment he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. More disturbing still were Willow's increasing struggles with the boundaries of reality. She insisted she had seen Nellie, not just in dreams, but in waking moments, alive and present. She described vividly how Nellie would sit by the hospital window, smiling at her with that same cryptic expression she remembered from years ago, even waving at her as though beckoning her to come closer. She swore Daisy had called her Mommy, swore she had felt her tiny fingers wrapped tightly around her own, a grip filled with trust and love. But none of it had actually happened. Michael assured her that Daisy had been nowhere near her that day. Sasha had confirmed it. Yet the sensations remained so real, so deeply felt, that Willow couldn't separate the truth from the illusion anymore. The line between memory and delusion had begun to blur until everything felt suspect, her past, her identity, even her love for the children she had lost. In her rare lucid moments, Willow pleaded for understanding. She begged Michael not to look at her like a stranger, not to treat her as though she were dangerous. But her words were laced with desperation, and Michael, despite his best intentions, found himself retreating emotionally. The more she asked him to believe in her, the less he could. In his eyes, the woman he loved was vanishing, slipping into a shadow he could no longer reach. Behind her words, there was a flicker of something else, something that wasn't Willow. And even if he couldn't say it aloud, he feared that Nellie, in whatever form she now existed, was no longer a separate threat. She was inside Willow. She was growing stronger. And she was taking control. The terrifying truth was that Willow might never fully return. The real Willow, the one who had once nurtured her students, comforted her patients, and held her children close, was fading. In her place was something darker, something born of trauma and loss, something that remembered every slight, every failure, every tear. And as that other self grew more emboldened, more autonomous, the possibility of recovery became less about healing and more about containment. The medical team now faced an ethical dilemma. Could they treat Willow without destroying a part of her that she may have come to rely on for emotional survival? Or would they be forced to confront the unthinkable, that Willow, in her current state, might one day become a threat not only to herself, but to the very children she once vowed to protect? As whispers spread through Port Charles and the Quartermain estate grew increasingly silent around her, one question echoed louder than the rest. If Nellie was alive in Willow's mind, alive with intention, with memory, with malice, was there any way to exorcise her without destroying Willow entirely? And if not, was the town prepared to face the consequences of a woman who could no longer tell where her grief ended and her madness began? Willow now found herself caught in a war not only for her sanity but for her very soul. What had begun as an internal unraveling had evolved into a relentless battle of identities, with each passing day making it harder to tell where Willow ended and where the encroaching presence of Nellie began. It was no longer simply about memory loss or hallucinations, this was about control, about the sovereignty of the mind. There was a darkness blooming inside her, slow but persistent, feeding off her grief, her longing, her isolation. And the most harrowing question she now faced was whether she had the strength to destroy that darkness, or whether she even wanted to. Because in that darkness, there was something deceptively comforting. Nellie, in all her twisted glory, had never felt powerless. She had never let herself be pushed aside, discarded, or forgotten. And now, that same defiance pulsed through Willow's veins like a second heartbeat. Nellie offered her a warped sense of purpose, a cruel sense of empowerment. Through her, Willow could reclaim what was lost, not in truth, but in sensation. She could once again feel the thrill of being called Mom, even if only in her imagination. She could wield influence, provoke fear, and demand attention, things she hadn't felt in a long time. So the question was no longer how to silence Nellie, but whether she should. Because to erase that shadow might mean surrendering the only piece of herself that still believed she was a mother. Her inner world had become a fractured landscape, with memories twisting upon themselves, reality shifting like sand beneath her feet. And in the heart of that chaos, Nellie was building something. A new version of reality, one where Willow was not the woman who lost her children, but the one who fought to reclaim them, by force, by deception, by any means necessary. This was not simply a delusion, it was a dangerous reinvention. Every time Willow closed her eyes, she saw glimpses of that world, Daisy in her arms, Wiley by her side, Amelia laughing in the garden. The imagery was intoxicating, vivid, and deeply wrong. Because none of it was real. Yet it felt more real than the cold stares and whispered conversations that now greeted her in the hallways of GH. More real than Michael's guarded expressions. More real than the sterile detachment of the doctors who spoke about her like a case study rather than a human being unraveling before their eyes. As the boundary between self and shadow blurred, the stakes rose beyond mere mental health. Willow's freedom, her career, and perhaps even her life hung in the balance. A single misstep. An incident of violence, a stolen child, a psychotic break in the wrong place at the wrong time, could end everything. If she succumbed fully to Nellie's persona, there would be no protection, no forgiveness. The law would not see a grieving woman fighting for control, it would see a threat, a danger to society, and act accordingly. But if she denied that part of herself, if she forced Nellie into suppression without resolution, she risked triggering a complete psychological collapse. There were no easy paths left. Only perilous ones. What made the situation even more tragic was the fact that no one seemed to fully believe her anymore. The people she had once turned to for solace and support now watched her with suspicion or fear. She tried to speak, to explain the war inside her, the flashes of lucidity, the helplessness, but her words only seemed to deepen the distance between her and the people who mattered most. They didn't see the fractured woman gasping for help behind her eyes. They saw instability. Potential danger. And in a town like Port Charles, where secrets could be deadly and alliances were always shifting, trust was both fragile and fleeting. If no one believed in her, how could she hold on to herself? If the world no longer offered her a hand to hold, How could she climb out of the pit she was sinking into? And if Nellie truly took over? If that ruthless, manipulative, wounded persona became dominant, what would be left of the Willow who once believed in compassion, in forgiveness, in motherhood through nurturing rather than conquest? These were the questions that now haunted her every waking moment. Each time she looked in the mirror, she wondered who would look back. Would it be the woman who had loved unconditionally, who had fought for Wiley's well-being, who had once held on to hope even in the face of death? Or would it be the woman who had faked pregnancies, gaslit her enemies, and weaponized motherhood as a tool for revenge? The woman who had died years ago but whose spirit had clearly never left. This wasn't just a personal crisis anymore, it was becoming a reckoning for the entire town. If Willow fell completely under the spell of Nellie's influence, the consequences could be catastrophic. Not only for her, but for Sasha, for Daisy, for Michael, and for every child whose life she could twist in her desperate bid to rewrite history. Port Charles had seen its share of villains. But never one who wore the face of someone they all once trusted. Never one who blurred the lines so masterfully between victim and predator. In the end, this might not be Willow's downfall, it might be her rebirth. But what kind of rebirth remained to be seen? Would she emerge from this nightmare stronger, whole, redeemed? Or would she become the very thing she had once feared most, a vessel for a legacy of manipulation, grief, and destruction?